The moment the piano note echoed through Ravenswood's empty halls at 2 in the morning, Nora Vale understood she'd accepted a job that came with more than locked doors and dead lavender. She'd walked into a man's living tomb, and somewhere in the silence between those keys, a secret had been buried alongside his wife. Boston's autumn rain had a particular smell, exhaust mixed with wet asphalt and the faint sweetness of dumpster pastries outside the bakery on Newbury Street. Nora had grown familiar with it, the way you become intimate with things you'd rather forget. Her studio apartment was 600 square feet of peeling paint and a radiator that clanged like a prisoner rattling bars. The eviction notice, taped beside her easel, gave her 48 hours. She'd painted coastlines once. Sold 3 pieces to a gallery in Cambridge. Then her mother's medical bills arrived like waves, each one higher than the last, until the gallery owner stopped returning calls, and Nora's savings account showed 2 digits where there used to be 4. The email came on a Thursday. Subject line, immediate contract, restoration work, Vermont, $90,000, 3 months. Room and board included. The sender's name was Agnes Whitaker, and the tone suggested she'd interviewed 100 candidates before settling on desperation. Nora replied within 6 minutes. 2 days later, she stood in the gravel driveway of Ravenswood Estate, October wind pulling at her second-hand coat, staring at a house that looked like it had been designed to swallow sunlight. Stone walls climbed 3 stories, ivy choking the corners where gutters sagged. The garden, if you could call it that, was a graveyard of stems. Dead roses clung to trellises. Lavender beds had turned gray. A fountain in the center courtyard held leaves instead of water. The front door opened before she could knock. Agnes Whitaker was 70 if she was a day. Silver hair pulled into a bun so tight it could have been architectural. Her expression suggested she'd been interrupted mid-prayer and found the intrusion lacking. "You're the painter. Landscape restoration, yes." "Nora Vale. You're late." Nora checked her phone. "I'm 4 minutes early." Agnes stepped aside. "In this house, early is on time. On time is late. Late is unacceptable. Mr. Hale requires punctuality. He also requires silence, no music, no unnecessary conversation, and absolutely no questions about Mrs. Hale." The name hung in the air like smoke. Nora picked up her duffel bag and crossed the threshold into darkness that smelled of old wood and something sharper. Grief, maybe. Or the vinegar people used to clean things they couldn't bear to touch. If you're drawn to stories where broken places find light, hit subscribe. This garden has secrets we're only beginning to uncover. The contract sat on the kitchen table. 7 pages of legalese that boiled down to 2 rules. Restore the garden and the studio by January 15th, and never under any circumstance enter the east wing after sunset. Nora signed on page 6. Agnes witnessed. Then the older woman handed her a brass key that looked like it belonged in a Victorian novel. "Your quarters. 2nd floor, West Hall. Mr. Finch will meet you in the garden at 8 tomorrow morning. He's the groundskeeper. Caleb is his assistant. They'll show you what needs doing. And Mr. Hale, you'll see him when he wishes to be seen." That first night, Nora unpacked in a room that smelled of lavender sachets and lemon polish. The bed was a 4-poster antique. The window overlooked the garden, or what remained of it. Moonlight turned the dead stems silver. She counted 6 raised beds, a greenhouse with half its glass missing, and the studio, a separate building near the property's edge. Its windows dark. She was arranging her paints on the dresser when she heard it. Piano, not a melody exactly. Single notes, played with long pauses between, as if someone were testing whether the instrument still remembered how to speak. The sound came from below or maybe beside. It was hard to tell in a house this size. Nora pressed her ear to the floor. Another note. Then silence. She waited 10 minutes. Nothing. At breakfast, Agnes served oatmeal and information in equal measure. "Mr. Finch is 82. Caleb is 16 and shy. The studio hasn't been opened in 3 years. Mrs. Hale was the artist. Mr. Hale was the patron. They met at a gallery in Manhattan. She painted gardens. He bought entire collections to keep her work from being sold piecemeal. When she died, he locked the studio and let the garden die with her. How did she? No questions about Mrs. Hale. Nora met Mr. Finch in the garden at 7:58. He was a scarecrow of a man, all bones and flannel with hands that looked like they'd been shaking the earth for decades. Caleb stood beside him, a tall kid with brown hair falling into his eyes and dirt already under his nails. Finch gestured at the beds. Lavender's dead. Roses might come back if we prune hard. Fountain needs clearing. Greenhouse needs new glass. Studio's locked, but Mrs. Whitaker says you've got access starting Monday. What happened here? Finch looked at the fountain. What happens to any garden when nobody tends it? It stops. They worked in silence, pulling dead stems, raking leaves, clearing the fountain's basin of 3 years' worth of debris. Nora's hands blistered within an hour. Caleb brought her gloves without being asked. By noon, the first bed was cleared down to soil. That's when the window opened. East wing, second floor. A man stood behind the glass, backlit so she couldn't see his face, only the outline. Tall, broad-shouldered, completely still. He watched for maybe 30 seconds. Then the window closed and the curtain fell back into place. Finch kept raking. That's Mr. Hale. Should I? No. At lunch, Agnes set out sandwiches and iced tea in the kitchen. Nora ate standing up, too aware of the dirt on her jeans to sit on the upholstered chairs. She was finishing her second glass of tea when she heard footsteps in the hall. Heavy. Deliberate. They stopped outside the kitchen door. Nora held her breath. The footsteps continued. A door opened somewhere deeper in the house, then closed with a soft click that sounded like a period at the end of a sentence nobody had wanted to finish. Agnes appeared in the doorway, holding a clipboard. You'll start in the studio Monday. Mrs. Hale's supplies are still there. Canvases, brushes, paints. Mr. Hale wants you to catalog everything. If something's salvageable, note it. If it's ruined, dispose of it properly. She was particular about her materials. He'd prefer they not end up in a landfill. I thought I was here to restore the garden. You are. The studio is part of the garden. Mrs. Hale painted there every day. It overlooks the lavender beds. She said the light was perfect at 4 in the afternoon. Mr. Hale believes restoring one without the other would be incomplete. That night, the piano played again. This time, Nora didn't stay in her room. She followed the sound down the west staircase across the main hall, past the library with its floor-to-ceiling shelves, and stopped outside a door that had been left slightly ajar. Candlelight flickered inside. The music was Chopin. Nocturne in E-flat major. Her mother used to play it. Nora pushed the door open 6 inches. Adrian Hale sat at a grand piano, his back to her, shoulders curved like parentheses around grief. His hair was dark, touched with gray at the temples. His hands moved across the keys with a precision that suggested muscle memory. Play this, feel nothing. Repeat until dawn. He stopped mid-phrase. I know you're there. Nora froze. Agnes told you the rules. No questions. No curiosity. I'm paying you to restore a garden, not to catalog my insomnia. His voice was low, controlled, the kind of tone that came from years of holding things in until they calcified. Go back to your room, Miss Vale. If I wanted company, I'd have hired a therapist. She stepped back. The floorboard creaked. He didn't turn around. One more thing. The studio opens Monday. You'll find Mrs. Hale's final painting still on the easel. Don't touch it. Don't move it. And don't ask me why. Monday arrived with frost on the windows and a sky the color of old pewter. Nora found the studio key on the kitchen counter beside a note in Agnes's precise script. 8 a.m. Mr. Hale will meet you there. He was already waiting when she arrived. Standing beside the studio door like a sentry, up close, Adrian Hale looked like a man who'd forgotten how to sleep. Dark circles framed eyes that were green, or maybe gray, depending on the light. His jaw was sharp enough to cut glass, and his suit was tailored within an inch of its life, as if dressing well could hold the pieces of him together. Miss Vale? Mr. Hale? He unlocked the door. The hinges screamed. Inside, dust motes swirled in shafts of morning light. The studio was exactly as Agnes had described. North-facing windows, wooden floors, shelves lined with paint tubes and brushes still crusted with color. An easel stood in the center, draped with a white cloth. The air smelled of linseed oil and thyme. Adrian didn't move past the threshold. This was her space. I haven't been inside since the funeral. Agnes dusts once a month to keep the damp out, but otherwise everything is as she left it. Your job is to determine what can be saved and what can't. I want a full inventory by the end of the week. After that, you'll begin cleaning and organizing. If you need supplies, give Agnes a list. If you have questions about her work, ask me. If you have questions about anything else, don't. Nora counted 3 seconds. What's under the cloth? I told you not to touch it. I'm not touching it. I'm asking what it is. His jaw tightened. Her last painting. She was working on it the day she died. It's unfinished. I'd like it to stay that way. You hired me to restore this studio. How am I supposed to do that if I don't know what I'm working around? For a moment she thought he might walk out. Instead, he stepped inside, crossed to the easel, and pulled the cloth away with the care someone might use handling a relic. The canvas showed a garden in twilight. Lavender beds in full bloom, a fountain running clear, and in the background, barely sketched in charcoal, 2 figures, a man and a woman, their faces obscured, their hands almost touching. She called it the Garden of Second Chances, Adrian said quietly. She never got to finish it. I don't want anyone else to either. It stays as it is. Understood? Nora nodded. He draped the cloth back over the canvas, then turned to face her fully for the first time. I need to be clear about something, Miss Vale. This isn't just a restoration project. This is an exorcism of sorts. My wife believed gardens had memory. She said they remembered the hands that tended them, the conversations held over their beds, the promises made in their shadows. When she died, I let this place die because I couldn't bear to touch what she'd loved. But her will specified that the garden and studio should be maintained. I've been in violation of that for 3 years. You're here to make me keep a promise I never wanted to make. That means we'll be working in close proximity. You'll see me at my worst. I'll see you covered in dirt and paint. We will not become friends. We will not share meals or stories or late-night conversations about the meaning of life. You will do your job. I will pay you. And when January 15th comes, you will leave. And I will finally be able to tell myself I did right by her memory, even if I failed at everything else. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. This is your first week's pay. $5,000. You'll receive the same every Friday until the contract ends. If you complete the work to my satisfaction, there's a bonus. If you breach any of the terms, particularly the silence clause about Mrs. Hale, you'll be terminated immediately, and you'll owe me triple the amount already paid. Agnes has the NDA. Sign it today. Nora took the envelope. The weight of it felt obscene. What if I find something in here that raises questions about her work? Her methods, her materials, her... Then you'll write them down and I'll answer them in writing. No conversations. No therapy sessions disguised as professional inquiries. This is a transaction, Miss Vale. Let's keep it that way. He walked to the door, paused with his hand on the frame. One last thing. The garden comes back to life in stages. Don't expect miracles. Lavender takes time. Roses need patience. If you rush it, you'll kill everything you're trying to save. My wife understood that. I hope you do too. Then he was gone. And Nora was alone with a dead woman's brushes and a painting that looked like hope someone had started to sketch and then abandoned halfway through. She opened the envelope. 50 $100 bills, crisp as autumn leaves. She thought about the eviction notice, the hospital bills, the gallery owner who'd stopped calling. Then she thought about the man who'd just walked out of this room like he was fleeing a crime scene. 90 days, $90,000, and a garden that refused to stay dead. Nora picked up a clipboard and started counting paint tubes. The first 2 weeks passed in a blur of soil and silence. Nora worked the garden from sunrise to noon, then spent afternoons in the studio, cataloging supplies and cleaning brushes that had hardened into sculptures of neglect. Finch and Caleb became her anchors, the old man with his steady rhythm and the boy with his careful questions about which plants might forgive being forgotten. Adrian appeared 3 times, once to approve the greenhouse repair estimate, once to leave a check on the kitchen counter, and once to stand at the studio window, watching her work for 5 minutes before walking away without a word. Agnes served meals at precise intervals and collected signed documents with the efficiency of a bailiff. The NDA was 12 pages long. Nora signed without reading past the first paragraph. She'd agreed to silence. What did it matter what shade of quiet they required? Then October bled into November, and the town of Millbrook decided to hold its annual charity gala at the estate. Agnes delivered the news over breakfast. Mr. Hale hosts it every year. Mrs. Hale started the tradition, a fundraiser for the Arts Foundation she established. He's tried to cancel it twice. The board won't allow it. You'll need to make the garden presentable by Saturday. That gives you 4 days. The garden's not ready for guests. The garden will never be ready, Miss Vale. But the east beds can be cleared, the fountain can run, and the pathway can be lined with luminarias. That's enough for people to drink champagne and pretend they care about supporting local artists. Mr. Hale will handle the house. You handle the garden. And for God's sake, wear something appropriate. You're not a servant. You're a contractor. There's a difference. Saturday arrived cold and clear. Nora spent the morning stringing lights through the bare branches of the oak trees and arranging mums in pots along the stone path. The fountain ran clear for the first time in 3 years, and even though the lavender beds were still skeletal, she'd planted pansies as placeholders, small bursts of purple and yellow that suggested memory, if not resurrection. At 6, she retreated to her room and stared at the closet. She'd packed for 3 months of manual labor, not black tie fundraisers. The best she had was a navy dress she'd worn to her mother's funeral and a pair of heels that pinched after 20 minutes. It would have to do. Guests arrived at 7 in town cars and Teslas. Nora watched from the studio window as men in tuxedos and women in gowns picked their way across the garden path, exclaiming over the lights and the fountain as if the place hadn't been a mausoleum last month. She was about to retreat to her room when Agnes appeared at the studio door. Mr. Hale wants you at the reception. You're to be introduced as the restoration consultant. Several board members want to meet you, and one of the major donors is a landscape architect. He'll have questions. Try not to embarrass us. The house had been transformed. Candles everywhere. A string quartet in the corner of the ballroom. Tables draped in white linen, each one topped with centerpieces that looked like they cost more than Nora's monthly rent used to. Adrian stood near the fireplace, surrounded by a semicircle of people who laughed too loudly at things that probably weren't funny. He wore a tuxedo the way some men wore armor. Perfectly fitted, strategically deployed, entirely inaccessible. Then his eyes found hers across the room. For 3 seconds, the crowd disappeared. He excused himself from the circle and crossed the floor with the deliberate pace of someone who'd spent years learning how to move through rooms without being touched. Miss Vale, Mr. Hale, I see Agnes put you to work. The garden's not finished. It's enough. He glanced at the windows where her lights glowed against the darkness. She would have liked what you did with the pansies. Purple was her favorite color. She said it was the color of things trying to be remembered. Before Nora could respond, a man in a gray suit materialized beside them. He was 60, silver-haired, with the kind of smile that suggested he'd bought and sold smaller men before breakfast. Adrian, you didn't tell me you'd hired someone. I thought you'd given up on the garden. Richard, this is Nora Vale. She's restoring the grounds in the studio. Richard extended a hand. His grip was firm enough to be a test. Richard Brennan, I'm on the foundation board. Also happen to run a landscape architecture firm in Boston. Adrian's been dodging my calls for 2 years, trying to avoid letting us assess the property. I'm glad someone finally convinced him. I convinced myself, Adrian said quietly. Sure you did. Richard turned to Nora. So what's your approach? Are we talking native plantings, formal beds? Or are you trying to recreate what Lydia had? Nora hesitated. She'd been cataloging Lydia's sketches all week. Pages of notes about bloom times and companion planting and the way lavender needed full sun and terrible soil to thrive. Mrs. Hale had a system. I'm trying to honor it while making it sustainable. Sustainable. Richard's smile sharpened. That's code for I'm winging it. Look, no offense, but do you have formal training? Because I could recommend a team. Miss Vale studied landscape painting at RISD, Adrian interrupted. His voice was level, but there was steel underneath. She understands color, composition, and the relationship between light and living things. That's more relevant to this project than a degree in turf management. Richard laughed. Adrian, we're talking about a 2-acre property. You need engineers, not artists. My wife was an artist. She built this garden with her hands and a library card. I trust Miss Vale to do the same. The air went taut. Richard cleared his throat. Of course. I didn't mean to imply. I know exactly what you meant. Adrian placed a hand on Nora's elbow, a touch so light it barely registered. If you'll excuse us, I need to introduce Miss Vale to the rest of the board. Enjoy the evening, Richard. He steered her toward the far side of the ballroom, his hand falling away the moment they were out of Richard's sightline. Nora kept her voice low. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. Richard thinks money solves everything. He tried to convince me to bulldoze the garden and install a putting green. If I'd let him talk to you for 5 more minutes, he'd have offered you a job and then tried to poach my contractor for his own projects. Would that have been so bad? Adrian stopped walking. They were near the windows now, far enough from the crowd that the quartet's music was just a murmur. You signed a contract, Miss Vale. 3 months. That means you're mine until January 15th, and I don't share resources I've paid for. I'm not a resource. No. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time, she saw something other than grief in his eyes. Maybe exhaustion, maybe regret, maybe just the faint recognition that he'd spoken to another human being without rehearsing the words first. You're not. I apologize, that came out wrong. What I meant is that I hired you because I believed you could do this work. Richard doesn't believe in anything except his own competence. If I'd let him undermine you, I'd be admitting I made a mistake in hiring you. And I don't make mistakes about my wife's garden. The possessive landed like a stone in still water. Before Nora could respond, a woman in a red gown approached, already talking before she'd fully arrived. Adrian, darling, you've been hiding. Is this the miracle worker we've been hearing about? The rest of the evening blurred into introductions and small talk and questions about soil pH that Nora answered with more confidence than she felt. Adrian stayed close, a silent anchor, redirecting conversations when they veered toward Lydia, and deflecting praise when people called him generous for opening the estate. At midnight, the last guest departed in a convoy of headlights. Nora stood in the garden, surrounded by her luminarias and pansies, and watched Adrian lock the front door from the inside. Through the window, she saw him lean against the doorframe, head bowed, shoulders sagging. Then the lights went out, and she was alone with the fountain's murmur and the faint scent of cold earth coming back to life. Thanksgiving came with an invitation Nora hadn't expected. Agnes delivered it on a Tuesday, sliding the cream envelope across the breakfast table, with the same expression she used when discussing trash removal schedules. Mr. Hale's sister is hosting dinner in Boston. She's requested your presence. He's agreed to bring you as his guest. Why would she want me there? Because she believes her brother needs reminding that the world contains more than dead plants and bad memories. And because she's Claire Hale Morrison, and what Claire wants, Claire orchestrates until reality bends to accommodate her. Agnes poured coffee with surgical precision. She'll ask you intrusive questions. Answer them vaguely. She'll try to read significance into everything you say. Let her. And for God's sake, don't mention the piano. Claire thinks Adrian sold it after the funeral. The drive to Boston was 53 minutes of silence, interrupted only by the GPS and Adrian's occasional muttered commentary about drivers who apparently learned to merge from a correspondence course. Nora watched bare trees give way to highway, then highway to brownstones, and tried not to think about how this felt less like a work obligation and more like something she didn't have a word for yet. Claire's townhouse was federal-style brick with window boxes full of winterberry. She answered the door in cashmere and pearls, looking like someone who'd been born knowing which fork to use and when to deploy strategic eye contact. Adrian. She pulled him into a hug that he tolerated rather than returned. And you must be Nora. I've heard so much about you. You've heard nothing about her, Adrian said, because there's nothing to hear. She's restoring the garden. That's the entire story. Claire smiled. Of course it is. Come in. Daniel's opening wine, and the kids are attempting not to destroy the dining room. Fair warning, they've been asking questions about Uncle Adrian's mystery woman all week. I tried to explain you're a contractor, but they're 8 and 10. They think every woman who shows up is a potential aunt. Inside, the house smelled of roasted turkey and something cinnamon-based. Daniel Morrison was a patent attorney with kind eyes and a firm handshake. Their children, Sophie and Max, orbited the adults like moons, asking Nora if she'd ever planted a tree. Yes. If she liked Uncle Adrian, complicated. And if she thought gardens were boring, depends on the garden. At dinner, Claire seated Nora beside Adrian and directly across from herself, a strategic placement that allowed maximum observation. The conversation moved through safe topics, the foundation's fundraising goals, Daniel's recent case involving a disputed trademark, Sophie's upcoming piano recital. Then Claire turned to Nora. So how did you end up at Ravenswood? Adrian's been turning down contractors for 3 years. What made you special? Desperation, Nora said before she could edit. He needed someone fast. I needed the work. It was timing, not specialness. Adrian set down his fork. That's not entirely accurate. I reviewed 12 applications. Miss Vale's portfolio included coastal landscapes. My wife painted coastlines before she moved to gardens. I thought the perspective would be relevant. Lydia loved the ocean, Claire said quietly. She grew up in Maine, said the Atlantic taught her about resilience, things that survive saltwater and storms don't break easily. She looked at Adrian. You haven't said her name in front of me in 2 years. I'm glad you're saying it now. I say it when it's necessary. No, you say it when you finally stopped punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault. Claire reached across the table and squeezed his hand. She died in a car accident, Adrian. You weren't driving. You weren't even in the state. Yet you've been living like you're serving a life sentence. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight, the kind that pressed down on shoulders and made breathing feel like a negotiation. Adrian pulled his hand back. Can we not do this in front of company? Nora's not company. She's the first person you've brought to a family dinner since the funeral. That makes her something. Claire turned to Nora. He hasn't told you how Lydia died, has he? Claire, it was raining, late October 3 years ago. She'd been at the studio all day working on that painting, the one with the 2 figures. She called Adrian around 6, said she was driving home, asked if he wanted her to pick up dinner. He was in New York for a meeting. He said yes. She never made it to the restaurant. A truck ran a red light on Route 7. She died on impact. Nora's chest tightened. I'm so sorry. Adrian blames himself because he asked her to stop for dinner. He thinks if he'd said no, she'd have taken a different route or left 10 minutes earlier or... Claire's voice cracked. He forgets that Lydia made her own choices. She wanted to get him dinner. She chose to drive in the rain. It was an accident, not a consequence of his failure to protect her from the universe. Adrian stood.
I need air. He walked out through the kitchen door into the small courtyard garden.
Through the window, Nora watched him lean against the brick wall, head tipped back, eyes closed. Claire sighed. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have ambushed him. But someone had to say it, and he won't talk to therapists, and he's been disappearing into that house like it's a tomb he's building one stone at a time. He's trying, Nora said. The garden's coming back. That's something, is it? Or is it just another way to keep her memory alive while refusing to build anything new? Nora didn't have an answer for that. 10 minutes later, Adrian returned, composed again, apologized to the table, and asked Sophie about her piano piece. The rest of the meal proceeded with careful normalcy. Dessert, coffee, Daniel's story about a client who'd tried to trademark the word Tuesday. As they were leaving, Claire pulled Nora aside. Take care of him. I know that's not in your job description, but he listens to you in a way he hasn't listened to anyone in years. If you see him drowning, throw him a rope, even if he insists he doesn't want one. In the car, Adrian drove in silence for 20 minutes before speaking. I'm sorry you had to witness that. Your sister loves you. My sister thinks love means dismantling people's defenses until they have no choice but to feel things they've spent years learning not to feel. He glanced at her. She's not wrong. She's just exhausting. She said Lydia chose to drive in the rain. Lydia chose a lot of things. That doesn't mean I couldn't have chosen differently. His hands tightened on the wheel. I asked her to get dinner because I was too busy networking to care that she'd been painting for 12 hours and probably needed rest more than I needed pad thai. If I'd said no, she'd have gone straight home. She'd have been in the studio the next morning. We'd be planning which gallery to show the Garden of Second Chances in. Instead, I'm paying someone to resurrect a garden I killed because I couldn't stand to touch what she'd loved without her. Nora waited 3 breaths. She wouldn't want you living like this. You didn't know her. No, but I've seen her work. And anyone who paints gardens with that much hope doesn't do it so the person she loves can spend 3 years suffocating in guilt. The mile markers passed in silence, then so quietly she almost missed it. She used to say gardens were proof that things could be buried and still come back. I told her that was naive. She told me I was terrified of being wrong. Turns out we were both right. When they reached Ravenswood, Adrian walked her to the door. "Thank you for coming tonight. Claire's been trying to set me up with her friend's daughters for 2 years. Bringing you meant she'd stop, even if it was only temporary. Happy to be your human shield," he almost smiled. "You're more than that, Miss Vale, though I'm not entirely sure what." Then he was gone, and Nora was standing in the dark entryway, wondering when exactly this stopped being a job and became something that felt dangerously close to complicity in another person's resurrection. December arrived with snow that turned Ravenswood into something from a Gothic novel, all white silence and dark windows and the kind of cold that made bones ache. Nora worked the greenhouse now, coaxing seedlings under grow lights while the garden outside slept beneath 3 inches of accumulation. Adrian had started appearing in the studio. Not to supervise, not to inspect, just to sit in the corner chair with a book he never seemed to read. While Nora sorted through Lydia's canvases and made notes about which ones could be restored and which had been too damaged by time and neglect. They didn't talk much. But the silence had changed texture, less like avoidance, more like two people learning to occupy the same space, without requiring constant translation. Then the invitation came. It was addressed to Adrian but delivered by a courier, who looked like he'd been hired specifically to convey importance. Agnes brought it to the studio, the Whitney Museum. They're mounting a retrospective of emerging artists from the last decade. They want to include 3 of Mrs. Hale's pieces. The opening is next Saturday. Black tie, press coverage. Mr. Hale will need a +1, and frankly, I'm too old to smile at strangers for 3 hours. Adrian looked up from his book. "I'm not going." "You are, because the foundation board voted unanimously to accept on your behalf, and if you don't show up, Claire will drive here and drag you to Manhattan herself. Besides, Miss Vale should see Lydia's work in a proper gallery. It'll give her context for the restoration." Nora started to protest, but Agnes was already walking out, heels clicking a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like "case closed." Adrian closed his book. "You don't have to come. I can call Claire and tell her I'm bringing Daniel. Or I can go alone and leave early. Museums make me feel like I'm attending my own autopsy." Was Lydia's work in museums often? 5 group shows, 2 solo exhibitions. The Times called her a painter of sanctuary spaces. She hated that review. Said it made her sound like she painted churches instead of gardens where people had fucked and fought and forgiven each other. He stood, crossed to the window. The Whitney piece will be Coastal Morning, The Lavender Conversation, and Stormlight. All sold to private collectors after her death. I tried to buy them back. 2 of the 3 refused. Said Lydia would have wanted her work in the world, not locked in a widower's vault. They were right. Probably. He turned. "If you come, you'll meet her friends. Her gallerist. The people who knew her when she was alive and whole and not just a name I whispered a dead lavender at 2 in the morning. They'll ask you about the restoration. They'll try to determine if I'm exploiting you or rehabilitating myself, and at least one of them will imply that I killed her through neglect or cruelty, or sheer emotional unavailability."
Can you handle that?
Nora thought about the eviction notice, the hospital bills, the gallery owner who'd stopped calling. "I've been underestimated before. I'll survive being judged by people who think they know your marriage better than you did." Saturday came with a rental car and a 5-hour drive south. Adrian handled the steering wheel like it was an obligation. Nora watched the landscape turn from rural Vermont to the thickening sprawl of the I-95 corridor, and tried not to think about the dress Agnes had somehow procured. A deep green silk that fit like it had been tailored, because it probably had been. The Whitney opening was everything Nora expected and nothing she was prepared for. Champagne and gallery lights and people who spoke in that particular cadence of individuals who believed their opinions shaped reality. Lydia's paintings hung in the second-floor gallery, each one spotlit like evidence in a trial nobody had agreed to attend. Coastal Morning showed a beach at dawn, tide going out, a single figure, female, dark-haired, standing ankle-deep in water. The Lavender Conversation depicted 2 women sitting in a garden, their hands almost touching across a small table, lavender surrounding them like a conspiracy of purple. Stormlight was darker, a garden at dusk, rain coming in sideways. everything bent and blurred except for a greenhouse in the background, its lights burning steady against the wind. Nora stood in front of Stormlight for 5 minutes. She could feel Adrian beside her, not looking at the painting, looking instead at the floor as if the hardwood might offer absolution. A woman approached, late 50s, black suit, severe bob. Adrian Hale. I wondered if you'd actually come. Adrian straightened. Vanessa, good to see you, is it? Vanessa's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. You've been avoiding my calls for 3 years. I represent 2 collectors who want to donate Lydia's work to permanent collections. You won't return emails. Your lawyer sends boilerplate refusals. I'm starting to think you'd rather her legacy disappear than deal with the administrative inconvenience of letting her matter to anyone beyond yourself. That's not fair. Fair? You locked yourself in that house and let her garden die. The woman who painted these, Vanessa gestured at the walls, believed in generosity, in sharing beauty, and making sure the work outlasted the maker, and you've spent 3 years hoarding her memory like it's the only thing keeping you alive. Nora stepped forward. He's restoring the garden. And the studio. Everything she built is coming back. Vanessa's gaze shifted, assessing. And you are? Nora Vale, I'm the restoration consultant. Consultant, the word dripped skepticism. How convenient. Adrian finds someone to do the labor he couldn't bear to do himself. And suddenly he's a grieving hero instead of a man who abandoned his wife's legacy the moment it became inconvenient. Adrian's voice went cold. Lydia died in my arms. I held her while the paramedics tried to restart her heart. I signed the DNR when they told me her brain was gone. I stood in the rain at her funeral and listened to people tell me she's in a better place, as if that's supposed to comfort me while I'm deciding whether to bury her in the dress she wore on our wedding day, or the paint-stained sweater she refused to throw away. So don't lecture me about legacy, Vanessa. You sold her paintings to people who hang them in summer houses they visit twice a year. I'm trying to keep alive the place where she actually created them. The silence that followed was the kind that makes other conversations stop. Vanessa's expression softened slightly. I'm sorry. That was cruel. She was my friend, Adrian. I miss her. And watching you disappear felt like losing her twice. I didn't disappear. I just stopped pretending I was fine when I wasn't. A man in a navy suit materialized beside them. Adrian, Christ, it's good to see you out in the world. Is this your... He looked at Nora. Sorry, I'm Marcus Chen. I covered Lydia's last show for Art Forum. You must be the new partner I've been hearing about. There's no partner, Adrian said quickly. This is Nora Vale. She's working on the estate restoration. Professional capacity only, Marcus grinned. Sure, professional. That's why you've been standing in front of Stormlight for 20 minutes looking like someone just excavated your chest cavity. He turned to Nora. Lydia painted that 3 weeks before she died. It's the only one where the garden looks like it's fighting back. Critics thought it was about climate change. I always thought it was about marriage. The work of keeping something alive when the weather turns. Adrian walked away. Nora found him 10 minutes later on the museum's terrace, leaning against the railing, staring at the city lights like they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. I'm sorry, she said. I shouldn't have spoken for you. You didn't say anything untrue. Vanessa needed to hear it. So did I. He didn't look at her. Marcus was right. Stormlight is about marriage. Lydia painted it after we had a fight. I told her I was tired of coming second to her work. She told me I was jealous of inanimate objects. We didn't speak for 2 days. Then she showed me the painting and said, "This is what we are, bent, battered, still standing, still burning." I bought her a greenhouse the next week. She cried. I told her crying over glass and metal was ridiculous. She told me I was emotionally constipated. We were both right. She sounds like she didn't let you get away with anything. She didn't, and I loved her for it, and I failed her anyway. Nora leaned beside him. You asked her to pick up dinner. That's not failure. That's Wednesday. It was Thursday, October 26th, 6:47 p.m. She called to say she was leaving the studio. I asked if she'd stop at the Thai place on Route 7. She said yes. The truck hit her at 7:03. The police said she died instantly. I got the call at 7:22. I was in a hotel bar in Midtown, drinking scotch with a venture capitalist who wanted to invest in the foundation. I didn't answer the first call. or the second. By the third, she'd been dead for 30 minutes, and I was laughing at some joke I can't remember now. That's failure, Miss Vale, not the request. The fact that I wasn't there when it mattered? You couldn't have known. That's what Claire says. That's what the therapist said before I fired him. That's what everyone says, as if not knowing absolves me of not being there. He finally looked at her. Do you know what I did with the Thai food? She'd ordered it before she left. It was sitting at the restaurant, paid for with her credit card. I picked it up on my way back from the morgue. Ate it cold at 2 a.m. because throwing it away felt like erasing the last thing she'd done. Turned out pad thai tastes like grief. I haven't been able to eat it since. Nora didn't have words for that, so she stood beside him and watched the city lights blur through tears she hadn't realized she was crying. When they drove home, Adrian turned on the radio. Classical station. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the one he played at 2 a.m. when he thought no one was listening. He didn't turn it off, and Nora didn't ask why. Christmas Eve came with 8 inches of snow and a power outage that lasted 6 hours. The house went dark at 4 p.m, and by 7, Agnes had retreated to her cottage on the east side of the property, leaving Nora and Adrian alone with candles and a fireplace that smoked when the wind shifted. Nora had been in the studio when the lights died, mid-inventory on a shelf of sketchbooks. She'd gathered them carefully, wrapped them in a tarp, and made her way back to the main house through snow that squeaked under her boots. The kitchen was the warmest room. Adrian was there feeding logs into the stove, his shirt sleeves rolled up, soot on his hands. Agnes left provisions, he said without turning. Soup, bread, cheese that cost more than my first car, and wine. Because apparently we can't have a blackout without alcohol. I told her we'd be fine. She looked at me like I'd suggested we survive on hope and good intentions. Nora set the sketchbooks on the table. I found these in the studio, Mrs. Hale's drafts. There are maybe 40 of them. I thought they should be somewhere dry. Adrian glanced at the wrapped bundle but didn't move to open it. She kept a sketchbook in every room. Said ideas had geography. Certain thoughts only happened in certain spaces. The studio books were for gardens. The bedroom books were for figures. The kitchen book was for still lifes she never painted because she got distracted cooking. Did you keep them? I kept everything. Threw nothing away. Agnes probably thinks I'm building a shrine. Claire definitely thinks I'm building a prison. The truth is somewhere in between. I'm just trying to hold on to proof she existed, in case my memory decides to edit her into someone easier to grieve. They ate soup at the kitchen table, the only sound the wind outside and the occasional pop of wood in the stove. It felt less like a meal and more like a vigil. When they'd finished, Adrian poured wine into glasses that looked like they belonged in a museum, and they moved to the living room, where the fireplace was the only thing standing between them and hypothermia. Nora sat on the floor back against the sofa. Adrian took the armchair. For a while, neither spoke. Then he said, "Tell me about your mother." Nora blinked. "What?" "You're here because you needed $90,000. Agnes showed me your initial application. You mentioned medical bills. I'm guessing cancer, or something chronic, which means you've been living in a hospital-adjacent hell for at least 2 years, watching someone you love disappear in increments. So tell me about her, because if I have to spend Christmas Eve with someone, I'd rather it be someone who understands what it's like to witness disintegration." Nora set down her wine. Ovarian cancer, stage 4 by the time they found it. She was a music teacher. Taught piano to kids who mostly just wanted to play video game soundtracks. She loved it anyway. Said music was the thing that kept people human when everything else stripped them down. She died in March. I was with her. She asked me to play Chopin before she went. I did. She closed her eyes halfway through the nocturne and never opened them again. Adrian stared at the fire. That's why you stood outside the music room. The first night. You heard the piano and I thought someone was talking to her. Stupid, I know. But grief makes you believe in things you'd normally dismiss as magical thinking. It's not stupid. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. After Lydia died, I used to hear her in the garden. Not her voice. Her presence. The specific way the air changed when she was working. Quieter, more focused. I'd walk outside at dawn and feel her everywhere. Agnes said it was trauma. Claire said it was love. The therapist said it was my brain trying to construct continuity in the absence of the person who defined my reality. I think it was just me refusing to let her be fully dead. Is that why you locked the studio? I locked the studio because I couldn't stand to see her work unfinished. Every canvas she didn't complete felt like an accusation. If I'd been more supportive, more present, more worthy of her time, maybe she'd have painted faster. Maybe she'd have finished the Garden of Second Chances. Maybe she'd have had a legacy instead of fragments. He finished his wine. And before you tell me that's irrational, I know. But knowing doesn't stop the feeling. Nora pulled one of the sketchbooks from the tarp, flipped it open carefully. The first page showed a garden in spring, tulips and daffodils sketched in charcoal with notes in the margin about color theory and companion planting. The second page was a portrait. A man, dark hair, sharp jaw, eyes that looked directly at the viewer with an expression somewhere between challenge and invitation. She turned the book so Adrian could see. "Is this you?" He stared at the sketch. She drew that the week we met. I'd gone to her gallery opening, bought 6 paintings I didn't need because I wanted an excuse to talk to her. She said I had the posture of someone expecting disappointment. I told her she had the arrogance of someone who'd never experienced it. We had coffee. I fell in love somewhere between her second sentence and the moment she told me I was wrong about everything I thought I knew about art. What did you think you knew? That it was decoration, status, a way for rich people to launder money and pretend they had taste. She said art was documentation, proof that people had lived and felt and tried to translate the incommunicable into something others could witness. Then she showed me a painting of a coastline at sunset and asked what I saw. I said orange and purple. She said grief and hope, which was when I realized I'd been looking at the world wrong my entire life. Nora turned the page. Another sketch. The same man, but this time his expression was softer, almost vulnerable. In the margin, Lydia had written, "Adrian at rest, rare, document for posterity. She saw you. She saw through me. There's a difference." He stood, crossed to the window. Outside, snow fell in silence, accumulating on the garden beds and the greenhouse and the studio roof. "Do you know what the worst part is? Not her death. Not the absence. It's the guilt of continuing. Every morning I wake up and my first thought isn't she's gone. It's I'm still here. And I don't know why. As if surviving her is a moral failure instead of just the arbitrary mathematics of who was in which car on which night." Nora closed the sketchbook. "She wouldn't want you living like that. You keep saying that. As if you knew her. I know her work. And anyone who paints gardens with that much light doesn't do it. So the person she loves can spend the rest of his life sitting in the dark, cataloging ways he failed her." Adrian turned. "And if the dark is all I know how to navigate anymore, then you hire someone to turn on the lights. Even if it's temporary. Even if it's transactional. Even if it's just a woman with dirt under her nails who showed up because she needed money and stayed because—" Nora stopped. She'd been about to say something true and dangerous. Because what? Because the garden wants to come back. And maybe you do too. Even if you haven't admitted it yet. The silence that followed was different from the others, not avoidance, not grief, but something tentative and new, like the first shoots of lavender pushing through frozen ground. Adrian crossed the room slowly. Sat on the floor beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat from his body, the weight of his presence, the way his breathing had changed, shallower, faster, like someone on the edge of something they'd been avoiding for years. "I don't know how to do this," he said quietly. "I don't know how to let someone in without feeling like I'm erasing her, or betraying her, or proving that she was replaceable, which is the one thing she never was. I'm not asking to replace her. Then what are you asking? To be here, in the same room, without you treating it like a crime scene." He looked at her then. Really looked. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Nora saw something other than ghosts in his eyes, maybe curiosity, maybe fear, maybe just the faint recognition that loneliness has a statute of limitations, and his was long past expired. "The power will come back on," he said, "and when it does, we'll go back to being employer and contractor. You'll work the garden. I'll avoid the studio. Agnes will maintain the illusion that we're both functioning adults instead of 2 people marking time, until January 15th arrives and releases us from the obligation of proximity. Is that what you want?" "What I want is irrelevant. What's appropriate is clear. Appropriate is boring. Appropriate keeps people from getting hurt. Too late." Nora stood. "I'm already invested, Mr. Hale, in the garden. In the studio, in the story of a woman who painted hope and a man who won't let himself believe it's still available. So if you're planning to keep me at arm's length for the next 3 weeks, you'd better start practicing now, because I'm terrible at maintaining professional distance when I actually care about the outcome. She walked to the stairs, paused at the landing. Merry Christmas, Adrian. I hope you get what you're looking for, even if you don't know what it is yet. Then she was gone, and Adrian was alone with the fire and the sketchbooks and the slowly dawning realization that January 15th was starting to feel less like liberation and more like loss. The power came back on at 3 a.m. Nora woke to the sudden hum of the heating system and the digital clock blinking 12 in angry red. She lay there for 5 minutes listening to the house resettle into modernity, then gave up on sleep and pulled on her coat. The garden was silver under moonlight and fresh snow. She walked the path slowly, checking for damage, broken branches, crushed seedlings under the weight of ice. Everything was intact, sleeping but intact. She was kneeling beside the east lavender bed when she heard footsteps behind her. Adrian stood at the edge of the path, wearing a coat over his pajamas, his breath clouding in the cold. Couldn't sleep either? I wanted to check the plants. At 3 a.m? Plants don't care what time it is. If something's broken, it's broken now, not at a more convenient hour. She brushed snow off a dormant stem. Besides, it's peaceful out here. No expectations. No conversations about whether I'm crossing lines or just doing my job. He crossed the space between them slowly, stopped 3 feet away. About last night. You don't owe me an explanation. I owe you an apology. I said things were going to stay professional. Then I sat on the floor with you and talked about my marriage like you were a therapist instead of someone I'm paying to restore a garden. That wasn't fair. Life's not fair, Mr. Hale. You've taught me that much. Adrian. She looked up. What? My name is Adrian. You've been calling me Mr. Hale for 2 months like I'm your landlord, instead of someone who sits in the same room with you every afternoon pretending to read while actually watching you work. It's ridiculous. So call me Adrian, or call me nothing. But stop treating me like I'm your boss when we both know the power dynamic here is more complicated than that. Nora stood. How is it complicated? Because I need you more than you need me. You came here for money. I came here for... He stopped. Started over. I hired you to restore Lydia's garden. But somewhere between October and December, it stopped being about the garden and started being about whether I could survive having another person in this house without drowning in the guilt of not being alone. And the answer is barely. Some days I wake up and think maybe I can do this. Maybe I can be a person who has conversations and makes plans and believes the future contains something other than slow decay. Then I see you in the studio, sorting through her things with more care than I've shown them in 3 years. And I realize I've been using you as a proxy, a stand-in for the work I should be doing but can't, because facing her absence head-on would require admitting she's really gone. And she's not gone. She's everywhere. In the studio, in the garden, in every room of this house. I hear her voice in the wind. I see her in every painting on these walls. She's so present she might as well be haunting me. Except ghosts eventually fade. And Lydia refuses to. Nora stepped closer. Maybe because you won't let her. Maybe because letting her go feels like erasing her. Like saying she didn't matter enough to stay broken over. Being broken isn't a tribute. It's just being broken. Then what's the alternative? Move on, find someone new? Pretend 3 years of marriage can be replaced with the right amount of time and effort? That's not how love works, Nora. You don't just... He stopped. Breathed. You don't just stop. No one's asking you to stop loving her. They're asking you to stop using her memory as a reason to refuse everything else. The silence stretched. Then Adrian reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. Opened it. Inside was a ring, simple gold band, no stone, just an inscription too small to read in the moonlight. She wore this every day. I gave it to her on our first anniversary. The inscription says, "Still burning," which was our shorthand for still fighting, still trying, still showing up even when it's hard. After she died, I kept it in my desk drawer. Then I moved it to the safe, then to the studio. I've been carrying it for 2 weeks, trying to figure out where it belongs now that she's not here to wear it. Nora stared at the ring. Why are you showing me this? Because I need someone to tell me what to do with it. Agnes says bury it with her ashes. Claire says donate it to the foundation for auction. The therapist said the ring is a symbol of attachment I need to release, but none of them understand that this ring is the only proof I have that she chose me, that for 3 years someone looked at my broken, emotionally constipated self and said, yes, this one. I'll tie my life to his and see what happens. And now she's gone and I'm still here. And I don't know how to honor that choice except to keep everything exactly as it was. Frozen, preserved, untouched. That's not honoring her. That's embalming her. He closed the box. Then what do? You let the garden grow. You finish the inventory. You open the studio to people who loved her work. And you stop treating her death like it's the only story worth telling about your life together. Adrian put the box back in his pocket. And if I don't know how to tell any other story, then you practice. You start with small things, like calling me Nora instead of Miss Vale, like eating breakfast in the kitchen instead of your office, like playing the piano at a reasonable hour instead of 2 in the morning when you think no one's listening. You take one step, then another, and eventually you've walked far enough that you can turn around and see the distance you've covered without her. And if I don't want to cover distance without her, then you'll stay here, in this garden, in this house, for the rest of your life. And when you die, people will say Adrian Hale loved his wife so much he couldn't bear to outlive her, which sounds romantic until you realize it's just another way of saying he gave up. He flinched. That's cruel. It's true. And Lydia strikes me as someone who preferred truth over comfort. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out slowly and took her hand. His palm was warm despite the cold. His grip was steady. And when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. She would have liked you. She had a rule about people. If they told her the truth even when it was uncomfortable, they were worth keeping. She called it her no bullshit radius. You'd have made it past the first conversation. What about you? Did you make it past the first conversation? Barely. I told her she was wasting her talent painting gardens when she could be doing portraits for people who'd actually pay. She told me I was wasting my intelligence being a venture capitalist when I could be supporting artists who'd actually change the world. We argued for 2 hours. Then we went back to her studio, and she painted me into the lavender conversation as the man who was too stubborn to reach across the table. I asked her why she'd made me the one refusing connection. She said because that's who I was, someone who wanted closeness but didn't know how to ask for it. She was right. I proposed 3 months later. She said yes on the condition I learned to ask for what I needed, instead of expecting her to read my mind. I'm still terrible at it. Nora squeezed his hand. Then practice now. What do you need? He looked at their joined hands, at the garden around them, at the house where Lydia's paintings still hung and her brushes still waited in the studio and her memory refused to fade into something manageable. I need someone to tell me it's okay to want something other than grief, that building a new life doesn't erase the old one, that I can open the studio and finish the garden and maybe let someone else stand beside me, without it feeling like I'm betraying everything she was. It's okay. You don't know that. I know she painted gardens, and gardens don't grow in the past. They grow in the dirt, in the present. With hands willing to tend them, Nora stepped closer, close enough that she could see the individual strands of silver in his hair, the lines around his eyes, the way his jaw tightened when he was trying not to feel something. You asked what I need. I need you to stop treating me like I'm temporary. Like January 15th is when this ends instead of when it gets complicated. Because I don't want to leave, Adrian. I want to stay. I want to see the lavender bloom. I want to finish the studio. I want to watch you learn to play the piano at noon instead of midnight. And I don't know what that makes me, naive, or hopeful, or just someone who fell in love with a garden and accidentally fell for the man who let it die, because he didn't know how to live without the woman who planted it. The words hung in the frozen air. Adrian's hand tightened around hers. You can't fall for me. I'm a wreck. I'm a widower with more baggage than closet space. I play Chopin in the dark and eat cold Thai food and spend my nights cataloging the ways I failed someone I can't bring back. You deserve better than someone who's still learning how to exist. Maybe. But I don't want better. I want this. Broken and complicated and completely inappropriate. I want mornings in the garden and afternoons in the studio, and evenings where you sit in the corner pretending to read while I sort through canvases. I want to hear you play the piano and argue with your sister, and tell me stories about Lydia that make her real instead of mythical. I want all of it. Even the grief. Especially the grief. Because grief means you loved someone enough that losing them rewrote your entire life. And I'd rather be with someone who knows how to love that deeply than someone who's never been broken at all. He pulled her closer, not kissing, just holding, his forehead pressed against hers, his breath warm against her cold skin. This is a terrible idea. Probably. It'll complicate everything. Definitely. January 15th is 6 weeks away. A lot can grow in 6 weeks, he laughed. It was a small sound, raw and unexpected. You're infuriatingly optimistic. You're infuriatingly stubborn. We'll destroy each other, or save each other. 50-50 odds, he kissed her then. Soft and careful and tasting of snow and coffee and 3 years of wanting someone to tell him it was okay to stop punishing himself for surviving. When they pulled apart, his hands were still in her hair, and her fingers were tangled in his coat, and the garden around them was silent except for the wind through bare branches. If we do this, he said quietly, I need you to understand something. I'm not looking for a replacement. I'm not trying to rewrite history or find a new version of what I lost. I'm just trying to figure out if there's space in my life for something other than remembrance. And I don't know if there is, but I'd like to find out with you. If you're willing to risk the disappointment, I'm willing, even knowing I might fail, especially knowing that. Because failure means you tried, and trying is more than you've done in 3 years. They stood in the garden until the sky began to lighten, not talking, just holding each other against the cold. When they finally went inside, Agnes was in the kitchen making coffee and pretending she hadn't seen them through the window. Good morning, she said neutrally. I trust the garden survived the snow. It did, Adrian said. And the two of you? Did you survive the night? Nora poured herself coffee. We're working on it. Agnes almost smiled. Good. Mrs. Hale would have liked that. She always said the best gardens grew from broken ground. The email arrived on a Tuesday 3 weeks after Christmas. Agnes brought it to Nora in the studio, printed on expensive stationery, the kind lawyers used when they wanted you to understand this was serious. This came from Mr. Hale. He asked me to show it to you first. Nora read it twice. It was from Richard Brennan's law firm. The subject line, breach of contract. Inquiry, Ravenswood Estate restoration project. The letter outlined a complaint filed with the foundation board by an anonymous donor who claimed Adrian was misusing foundation funds by hiring an unqualified contractor, engaging in inappropriate personal conduct, and violating the terms of Lydia's will by allowing the estate to remain closed to the public beyond the 3-year grace period specified in her bequest. The final paragraph requested a full audit of expenses, documentation of Nora's credentials, and a formal investigation into whether Adrian's relationship with the contractor constituted a conflict of interest that justified removing him as executor of Lydia's artistic legacy. At the bottom, in handwriting that looked like it belonged in a Victorian novel, Adrian, I told you hiring her was a mistake. Fix this before it destroys what Lydia built. RB, Nora set the letter down carefully. He thinks we're having an affair? Yes, and technically he's not wrong. Agnes sat across from her. Mr. Hale anticipated this. Richard's been looking for an excuse to challenge Adrian's management of the estate since Mrs. Hale died. He believes the foundation should control Ravenswood directly, which would allow him to install his own team, open the property to tours, and monetize Mrs. Hale's legacy in ways she explicitly forbade in her will. This complaint gives him leverage. If the board investigates and finds evidence of impropriety, they can remove Adrian as executor, at which point Richard becomes the default guardian of everything Mrs. Hale created. Can he do that? If he proves Adrian violated the terms of the will, yes. And the will is specific. The estate must be maintained professionally. The studio must be open to scholars and artists by the 4th anniversary of her death, and any romantic relationships must be disclosed to the board to prevent conflicts of interest. Adrian has satisfied the first requirement by hiring you. He's on track to satisfy the second by opening the studio in March. But the third? Agnes folded her hands. The third is where things get complicated, because you and Mr. Hale have been seen together in Boston at family dinners at the Whitney opening. And while no one can prove anything inappropriate has occurred, the appearance is enough for Richard to raise questions. Especially if he has witnesses. Nora's stomach dropped. What kind of witnesses? Agnes pulled a second sheet from the envelope. It was a photograph. Black and white. Grainy like it had been taken from a distance. It showed Adrian and Nora in the garden, the night they'd stood together after the power outage. His hands in her hair, her fingers in his coat. The moment before they'd kissed. Where did this come from? Richard hired a private investigator. Apparently he's been watching the estate since November. He has photographs, timestamps, and a sworn statement from someone who claims to have witnessed multiple instances of physical affection between you and Mr. Hale. He's planning to present it to the board at the January meeting. If they rule against Adrian, he loses control of the estate. The studio gets turned into a public museum. The garden gets redesigned by committee, and Mrs. Hale's will, which specified that Adrian alone should determine how her work is shared, gets overturned in favor of whatever Richard thinks will generate the most revenue for the foundation. Nora's hand shook. This is my fault. We shouldn't have. You fell in love with a man who was trying to keep a promise to his dead wife. There's nothing wrong with that. What's wrong is Richard's belief that he has the right to weaponize it. Agnes stood. Mr. Hale is meeting with his attorney this afternoon. They're drafting a response, but he wanted you to know before the board does. He also wanted me to give you this. She handed Nora a third sheet, handwritten. Adrian's script, precise, careful, every letter formed with the kind of control that suggested he'd rewritten it multiple times. Nora, by the time you read this, you'll know about Richard's complaint. I'm sorry. I should have anticipated this. I should have maintained the professional distance I promised. I should have treated you like a contractor instead of someone I was starting to depend on in ways that have nothing to do with gardens and everything to do with not wanting to be alone anymore. You didn't sign up for this. You came here for money and stability and the promise of 3 months without complications. Instead, I've dragged you into a legal battle over whether a widower has the right to move on without asking permission from people who think they own his grief. Richard will argue you're unqualified. He'll suggest I hired you because I was lonely, or desperate, or trying to manufacture a connection that would justify ignoring professional boundaries. He'll point to every dinner, every conversation, every moment we've spent in proximity and suggest it proves I'm exploiting you, or that you're exploiting me. He'll ignore the fact that the garden is thriving, that the studio inventory is complete, that every deadline has been met with precision you didn't owe me. He'll reduce 3 months of work to a scandal because that's easier than admitting I hired the right person. I won't let him do that to you. My attorney is drafting a formal response. We're providing documentation of every expense, every milestone, every communication between us that proves this was always professional first. We're also prepared to disclose the nature of our relationship, if it comes to that. But I want you to understand you have a choice. You can walk away now. Terminate the contract. Return to Boston. I'll pay you everything you're owed, plus the bonus, plus enough to cover whatever damage this does to your reputation. No one will blame you for leaving. Claire certainly won't. Agnes will probably recommend it, or you can stay. You can stand beside me when the board convenes. You can testify that you were hired on merit, that the work speaks for itself, that whatever happened between us happened after the garden was already coming back to life. You can help me prove that grief doesn't have a statute of limitations and widowers don't need permission to rebuild their lives. But staying means risk. It means your name in headlines. It means strangers questioning your motives. It means months of depositions and audits and Richard's lawyers trying to find inconsistencies in your story. It means choosing to fight for something that was never supposed to be complicated. I'm not asking you to choose now. I'm asking you to think about what you want, not what's appropriate or professional or safe. What do you want? Because for the first time in 3 years, I know what I want. I want you here, in this garden, in this house, in my life, not as Lydia's replacement, not as a contractor, but as someone who saw a man drowning in his own past and threw him a rope without checking whether it was in her job description. If you choose to leave, I'll understand. If you choose to stay, I'll fight for you the way I should have fought for everything else worth keeping. The choice is yours. Adrian Nora read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, put it in her pocket, and turned to Agnes. Where is he? His office. With the attorney. They've been in there for 2 hours. Nora walked through the house, past the paintings, past the piano, past every room that still smelled like Lydia's lavender sachets, and knocked on the office door. Come in. Adrian sat behind his desk, A man in his 50s with silver hair and a briefcase that probably cost more than Nora's car beside him. Adrian stood when she entered. His expression was carefully neutral, the kind of blank that came from years of negotiating deals that could go either way. Nora, this is James Crawford, my attorney. James, I'm staying. She looked at Adrian. I'm not walking away because someone with a law degree and a vendetta thinks he gets to decide how you grieve or who you care about. I'm staying. I'm finishing the garden. I'm opening the studio. And if Richard Brennan wants to drag me in front of a board and question my qualifications, I'll bring receipts. I'll bring photographs of every bed I've cleared, every plant I've saved, every canvas I've cataloged. I'll bring Finch and Caleb and Agnes and everyone else who's watched me work 16-hour days because I actually care about what Lydia built. And if he wants to know whether you and I crossed professional lines, I'll tell him yes, we did. Because you're a human being who deserves connection. And I'm someone who fell in love with a garden and the man who couldn't bear to let it go. So let him file his complaint. Let him bring his investigators and his photographs and his anonymous donors. I'm not leaving. The silence that followed was absolute. James cleared his throat. That's quite a statement, Miss Vale, though I'd advise slightly more diplomatic phrasing when you're under oath. Adrian circled the desk slowly. You're sure? I've never been more sure of anything. This will get ugly. Richard doesn't lose gracefully, then he'll learn, because I'm not graceful either, and I'm very good at finishing what I start. Adrian looked at James. Can you give us a moment? Of course. The attorney gathered his papers and left, closing the door behind him. Adrian stepped closer. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do. Because if I walk away now, Richard wins. He gets to turn Lydia's legacy into a revenue stream, and you into a cautionary tale about grief. And I didn't spend 3 months resurrecting a dead garden just to watch someone bulldoze it, because they think love has an expiration date. This isn't about love. This is about a legal technicality, and a man who thinks he knows better than everyone else. No. This is about you finally choosing to fight for something that matters, and I'm not letting you do it alone. He touched her face. Gentle. Like she was something that might break if he held on too tight. If we lose, we won't, but if we do, if the board rules against me, if I lose the estate and the studio and the right to determine how Lydia's work is shared, what then? Then we rebuild somewhere else. We plant a new garden. We find a new studio. We keep going. Because that's what people do when they love something. They fight for it. Even when the odds are terrible. Even when everyone says it's hopeless. They show up and they fight. Adrian kissed her, hard and desperate and tasting like fear and hope in equal measure. When they pulled apart, his voice was rough. I love you. I didn't plan to. I didn't want to, but I do. And if Richard uses that against me, if loving you costs me everything Lydia left behind, I'll still choose you. Every time. Then let's make sure it doesn't cost you anything. Let's make sure Richard learns that some fights aren't worth starting. They spent the rest of the afternoon with James building a defense. Documentation of every expense. Photographs of the garden's transformation. Testimonials from Finch, Caleb, and Agnes about Nora's work ethic and expertise. A timeline proving that the romantic relationship began after the garden was already 60% restored, which meant it couldn't have been the reason for hiring her. By evening, they had a strategy. By midnight, they had a counterclaim, alleging that Richard had violated attorney-client privilege by hiring investigators to surveil a private estate without cause. And by the time, Nora fell asleep in Adrian's guest room. Not his room, not yet. They were being careful now. She understood exactly what she'd signed up for, a war over whether dead women's wishes mattered more than living men's hearts. The board meeting was scheduled for January 10th. 5 days before Nora's contract expired, Richard Brennan arrived early, accompanied by 2 attorneys and a manila folder thick enough to require its own briefcase. He greeted Adrian with a handshake that felt like a threat wrapped in civility. Adrian, good to see you. I wish it were under better circumstances. Richard, I wish you'd chosen better circumstances. The foundation boardroom was all dark wood and leather chairs, the kind of space designed to make decisions feel weighty and irreversible. 12 board members, 7 women, 5 men, ages ranging from 40 to 75. Each one a donor, a collector, or someone who'd known Lydia personally. Claire sat in the back row, her expression murderous. Agnes had declined to attend, citing her age and her conviction that some battles are fought better without witnesses who might say things they can't take. Back Nora sat beside Adrian at the defendant's table because that's what this felt like. A trial where the verdict had been written before the evidence was presented. Richard stood. Thank you all for convening on short notice. I've called this meeting because I have serious concerns about the management of Ravenswood Estate and whether Mr. Hale is honoring the terms of his late wife's will. As you know, Lydia Hale specified that the estate be maintained professionally, open to scholars within 4 years of her death, and managed without conflicts of interest. I believe Mr. Hale has violated all 3 requirements. He opened the folder. Photographs spilled across the table. Adrian and Nora in the garden. At the Whitney opening, in Claire's townhouse. Each one time-stamped, captioned, annotated with locations and dates. These images were taken over a 3-month period by a licensed investigator. They show Mr. Hale engaging in what can only be described as a romantic relationship with his contractor, a woman with no formal training in landscape architecture, no references from recognized firms, and no prior experience managing restoration projects of this scale. I submit that Miss Vale was not hired for her qualifications. She was hired because Mr. Hale was lonely, desperate, and willing to exploit his late wife's legacy to manufacture a connection with someone young enough to be careful. Adrian's voice was ice. Finish that sentence and you'll be hearing from my defamation attorney before you leave this room. Richard smiled. I'm simply presenting facts. Miss Vale is 32. You're 47. She was hired 3 months after her mother died, when she was financially vulnerable and emotionally compromised. The power differential alone raises questions about consent and exploitation. I consented to everything, Nora interrupted, including telling you to go to hell if you think my age or my grief makes me incapable of making informed decisions about my career or my personal life. One of the board members, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and reading glasses, leaned forward. Miss Vale, can you explain your qualifications for this project? Mr. Brennan claims you have no formal training. I studied landscape painting at RISD. I understand composition, color theory, and the relationship between light and living things. Mrs. Hale's garden wasn't designed by an architect. It was designed by an artist who understood that gardens are paintings you walk through. I approached the restoration the same way she approached the creation, with respect for what grows naturally and a willingness to let the space guide the work instead of imposing rigid plans that ignore the soil's actual needs. That's lovely rhetoric, Richard said. But can you provide documentation of your work? Invoices, receipts, progress reports? James Crawford stood. We've submitted a complete accounting. Every expense tracked. Every milestone documented. Miss Vale has exceeded every deadline specified in the contract. The garden is 80% restored. The studio inventory is complete, and Mrs. Hale's final painting has been preserved exactly as Mr. Hale requested. If you're questioning the quality of the work, I invite you to visit the estate and see for yourselves. I'm not questioning the quality. I'm questioning the motive. Richard pulled out another photograph. This one showed Adrian and Nora standing in the garden at night, foreheads pressed together, his hands in her hair. This was taken on Christmas Eve, a full month before the contract was set to expire. It suggests the relationship began well before the work was complete, which means it likely influenced the hiring decision. That's a conflict of interest. And under the terms of Mrs. Hale's will, conflicts of interest are grounds for removing Mr. Hale as executor. Claire stood. You're a hypocrite, Richard. You've been trying to take control of this estate since the day Lydia died. You told Adrian to bulldoze the garden and install a golf course. You tried to sell her paintings to private collectors who'd never let them be seen publicly. You've spent 3 years treating her legacy like it's a business opportunity instead of the life's work of someone you claim to respect. So forgive me if I don't trust your sudden concern about conflicts of interest. Mrs. Morrison, this isn't personal. Everything you do is personal. You wanted Adrian to fail. You wanted him to stay broken. Because as long as he was incapacitated by grief, you could position yourself as the foundation's savior. But he didn't fail. He hired someone competent. The garden is coming back to life. And now you're scrambling to undermine him because you can't stand the idea that he might actually succeed without you. Richard's jaw tightened. I have a sworn statement from someone who worked on the estate. They claim Mr. Hale spent more time with Miss Vale than he did supervising the restoration. They describe multiple instances of inappropriate conduct, including, Who? Adrian's voice cut through the room. Who gave you this statement? Richard hesitated. The source requested anonymity. They feared retaliation. Name them now or withdraw the complaint. I'm not required to. You're alleging misconduct based on hearsay from an anonymous source. That's not evidence. That's character assassination. Adrian stood. I've spent 3 years trying to honor my wife's wishes while grieving her loss. I locked myself in that house because I couldn't bear to touch anything she'd loved. Then I hired Miss Vale because she understood what Lydia built better than any architect or contractor I interviewed. Yes, we developed feelings for each other. Yes, those feelings became something more. But that happened after the work was already succeeding. After the garden was already coming back. After I'd already started to believe I might survive the next 40 years without her. He pulled out the wooden box. Opened it. The ring inside caught the light. This was Lydia's. I've been carrying it for 3 months trying to figure out where it belongs. Agnes said bury it. Claire said donate it. My therapist said release it. But Nora, he looked at her. Nora said the ring is proof that Lydia chose me. That for 3 years someone saw my worst self and loved me anyway. And that dishonoring her choice by refusing to live would be the real betrayal. So I'm keeping the ring. I'm finishing the garden. I'm opening the studio in March. And I'm asking this board to respect the fact that widowers don't need permission to move forward with their lives. He closed the box. If you vote to remove me as executor, I'll fight you. I'll take this to court. I'll make sure every decision you've made regarding Lydia's legacy is scrutinized by people who actually cared about her, instead of her market value. Or you can trust that I hired the right person, that the work speaks for itself, and that what happens between Miss Vale and me is none of your business as long as the terms of the will are satisfied. The room went silent. Then the woman with the reading glasses spoke. I'd like to see the garden. Before we vote. I think we all should. Richard's face went pale. That's not necessary. It's absolutely necessary. If we're questioning whether the work justifies the relationship, we need to see the work. Mr. Hale, can the board visit Ravenswood this week? Adrian looked at Nora. She nodded. Friday, he said. 2 p.m. Bring whoever you want. See everything. Then vote. The meeting adjourned. Richard gathered his files with the tight-lipped fury of someone who'd just watched a sure victory slip away. As he passed Adrian, he leaned close. This isn't over. I'll find something. Everyone has secrets. Even you, Adrian, didn't flinch. I'm done hiding mine. Are you? The board arrived on Friday in a caravan of expensive cars. 12 people in wool coats and skeptical expressions, prepared to find evidence of waste, incompetence, or exploitation. What they found was a garden coming back to life. The east beds cleared, planted with cold hardy pansies and early bulbs that would bloom in March. The fountain, running clear, its basin scrubbed, the water reflecting winter sky. The greenhouse repaired, its shelves lined with seedlings in neat rows, each one labeled with Lydia's handwriting from sketches Nora had found in the studio. The paths, swept, lined with stones Finch had salvaged from the property's edges. The oak trees, hung with lights that would glow when spring came. And in the center, the lavender beds, dormant now but alive, their roots holding fast in soil that had been dead 3 months ago. Nora walked them through, explaining each decision. Why she'd chosen pansies instead of mums, why the fountain's water needed to recirculate instead of running constantly, why Lydia's companion planting notes had guided every bed's layout. Then they went to the studio. The inventory was complete. Every canvas cataloged, every brush cleaned, every paint tube sorted by color and age. Lydia's final painting still stood on the easel, draped in white cloth untouched. The board chair, a man named Victor Chen who'd known Lydia in art school, asked to see it. Adrian hesitated. Then he pulled the cloth away. The Garden of Second Chances looked different in winter light, the lavender less vivid. The figures more defined than Nora remembered, the woman's hand reaching, the man's hand almost meeting hers, the space between them the size of a breath or a choice. Victor stared at it for a long time. She was painting you. Us, Adrian corrected quietly. She always painted us. even when I was too stubborn to see it. The painting's unfinished. She died before she could complete it. I'm leaving it that way. Some things aren't meant to be finished by other hands. Victor nodded. She'd have liked that. She told me once that the best art leaves space for the viewer to complete it. That's what this does. It asks you to imagine the ending. He turned to the board. I've seen enough. The work is exceptional. The garden is being restored with more care than most professionals would show. And if Mr. Hale and Miss Vale have feelings for each other, that's their business, not ours. Mrs. Hale wanted the estate maintained and shared. That's happening. I move we dismiss Mr. Brennan's complaint and allow Mr. Hale to continue as executor. 8 board members agreed immediately. 2 abstained. 1, a man in his 70s who'd invested in Richard's firm, voted Richard Brennan was outvoted 11-1. As the board departed, Victor shook Adrian's hand. Lydia would have been proud of you. Not for the garden, for choosing to live. That's harder than maintaining flower beds. Claire hugged Nora so hard her ribs protested. Thank you. For not letting him give up, for making him fight, for being exactly what he needed even when he didn't know he needed it. When everyone had left, Adrian and Nora stood in the garden as sunset turned the snow pink and gold. We won, she said. For now. Richard won't quit. He'll find another angle. Then we'll fight that one too. Adrian took her hand. January 15th is Monday. I know. Your contract expires. I know that too. What happens then? Nora smiled. I sign a new one. If you're offering, I'm offering everything. New contract, fair wage. No more secrecy about what we are. And maybe, if you're willing, a permanent position. Not just restoring the garden. Building it, expanding it. Making it into something Lydia would have loved and something we create together. What about the studio? We open it in March, just like she wanted. Scholars, artists, anyone who wants to understand how she worked. You'll run it. You know her methods better than anyone now. And us? We stop pretending this is temporary. We stop treating love like it's a conflict of interest. We build something new on ground that's finally ready to grow. Nora kissed him as the sun set behind Ravenswood, painting the sky the colors Lydia used to paint hope, purple and gold, and the particular shade of pink that only exists when day becomes night and broken things remember how to be whole. The anonymous source came forward on January 12th. His name was Marcus Webb. He'd worked as a courier for Richard Brennan's firm for 6 years, and he'd been paid $5,000 to surveil Ravenswood Estate and document any evidence of impropriety between Adrian and Nora. He walked into James Crawford's office carrying a box of evidence. Photographs Richard had rejected because they showed Nora working, not canoodling. Receipts proving Richard had hired him in November, weeks before the board complaint was filed. And a recording, time-stamped, verified, legally obtained with consent, of Richard instructing Marcus to get me something I can use to bury Hale. James listened to the recording twice. Then he called Adrian. We have him. Brennan hired an investigator to manufacture evidence. That's witness tampering, abuse of legal process, and potentially fraud. Marcus is willing to testify. He says Brennan threatened to fire him if he didn't produce usable material. He also says Brennan told him to doctor timestamps on the photographs to make it look like your relationship with Miss Vale started earlier than it did. Adrian's voice was taut. Can we use this? We can destroy him with this. But it gets better. Marcus brought receipts showing Brennan billed the foundation for the investigation. That's embezzlement. He used donor funds to conduct a personal vendetta. The board will remove him from leadership. The foundation might press criminal charges. And if we file a civil suit for defamation, we'll win damages substantial enough to fund Lydia's foundation for the next decade. Adrian was silent for 10 seconds. Do it. File everything. I want Richard to understand that attacking people I love comes with consequences. James filed the counterclaim on January 13th. By the 14th, Richard's attorneys were calling to negotiate a settlement. By the 15th, the day Nora's contract officially expired, Richard Brennan had resigned from the foundation board, issued a public apology, and agreed to donate $1 million to the Lydia Hale Arts Foundation as restitution for misuse of funds. The press release went out that evening. Foundation board accepts resignation of Richard Brennan following investigation into misuse of funds. The Lydia Hale Arts Foundation announced today that Board member Richard Brennan has resigned following an internal investigation into allegations of financial misconduct. Mr. Brennan admitted to using foundation resources for personal purposes and has agreed to make restitution. The board reaffirmed its confidence in executor Adrian Hale and his management of Ravenswood Estate. The estate will open to scholars and visiting artists in March 2026, as specified in Mrs. Hale's will. Lydia believed in transparency, integrity, and the idea that art should serve people, not egos, said Board Chair Victor Chen. We're committed to honoring her vision and ensuring the foundation operates with the ethical standards she would have demanded. Nora read the release 3 times. Sitting in the studio with Lydia's sketchbook spread across the table, Adrian appeared in the doorway. It's done. Richard's gone. The board voted unanimously to keep me as executor, and they've approved funding for a full-time garden manager position. Salary, benefits, creative control over expansion projects. The job's yours if you want it. Nora looked up. What about us? Is that approved too? They don't get to approve us. We're not foundation property. He crossed the room, knelt beside her chair. But for the record, I told Victor we're together. I told him I'm in love with you. I told him that if loving you means I can't serve as executor, I'll resign and let someone else manage Lydia's legacy. Because I'm done choosing between honoring her memory and building a future that doesn't revolve around her absence. What did he say? He said Lydia would have called me an idiot for waiting 3 years to figure out something she understood on their first date. That love doesn't erase other loves. It just proves you're capable of it. Then he shook my hand and told me to stop making everything so complicated. Nora smiled. Sounds like good advice, and I'm terrible at taking good advice. But I'm trying. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. This is your new contract. Same terms as before. Except permanent employment, full benefits, and a clause specifying that romantic relationships between employees are permitted as long as they're disclosed to HR, which is Agnes. So she already knows and has filed the paperwork under things that were inevitable and took longer than they should have. Nora unfolded the contract. Read it carefully. There's no end date. That's the point. You're not a temporary fix. You're the person I want building this garden with me, for as long as you'll stay. What if I want to stay forever? Then I'll build you a studio beside Lydia's. I'll plant lavender until we run out of soil. I'll learn to make coffee the way you like it instead of the way I've been making it for 20 years. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving that choosing you wasn't a betrayal of her. It was the first honest thing I've done since she died. Nora signed the contract. Then she kissed him, and the studio filled with winter light and the scent of linseed oil and the quiet certainty that some endings are just the beginning of something that was waiting all along. The studio opened to the public on March 15th, 4 years to the day after Lydia's death. They'd planned a small gathering: scholars, artists, board members, a few journalists from art publications who'd covered Lydia's work when she was alive. 300 people showed up. They came from Boston and New York and as far as California, painters who'd studied Lydia's technique, collectors who owned her pieces, students who'd written dissertations on her use of color and light. They filled the garden paths and spilled into the greenhouse and lined up outside the studio door like pilgrims at a shrine. Adrian stood on the studio steps, Nora beside him, and addressed the crowd. My wife believed gardens were documents, proof that people had lived and loved and tried to make beauty in places that had been broken. She built this garden with her hands and her heart. She painted it in every season. And when she died, I let it die too because I couldn't bear to maintain what she'd loved without her. He paused. The crowd was silent except for the wind through bare branches and the fountain's murmur. 3 years later, I hired someone to restore it, not because I'd suddenly found the strength to face her absence, but because her will required it, and I'd run out of excuses to avoid keeping my promises. That person, Nora Vale, understood something I'd forgotten. Gardens don't belong to the people who plant them. They belong to the people willing to tend them. She brought this place back to life, not by erasing what Lydia built, but by respecting it enough to let it evolve. He gestured to the garden. The lavender beds were green now, new growth pushing through soil that had been dead 5 months ago. The roses had been pruned hard, their canes showing the first swellings of buds. The fountain ran clear, its basin filled with stones Nora had painted in shades of blue and purple. a tribute to Lydia's favorite colors. Inside this studio, you'll find my wife's tools, her canvases, her final painting. You'll also find evidence of the work Nora has done to preserve them. Every brush cleaned, every sketch catalogued, every note Lydia made about color and composition organized so scholars can study how she worked. This isn't a museum. It's a working studio. We'll bring artists here to create. We'll offer residencies to painters who work in Lydia's tradition, and we'll make sure her legacy isn't frozen in amber, but alive in the hands of people who understand what she was trying to do. He stepped aside. The studio is open. Please be respectful. Don't touch the final painting. And if you have questions, Nora can answer them better than I can. The crowd moved inside in waves. Nora stood near the easel, answering questions about Lydia's palette, her brushwork, the way she mixed colors to create depth and atmosphere. Adrian watched from the doorway, flanked by Claire and Victor, letting the space fill with voices and laughter and the particular energy of people encountering work they'd only seen in photographs. An hour into the event, a woman approached Nora. Late 40s, dark hair streaked with gray, carrying a leather portfolio. Miss Vale? I'm Dr. Elena Ruiz. I teach art history at NYU. I've been studying Lydia's work for 6 years. I'd like to propose a collaboration. A book documenting her technique with photographs of the studio and interviews with people who knew her process. Would Mr. Hale be open to that? Nora glanced at Adrian. He nodded. He would. But you should include the garden, too. Lydia didn't separate her painting from her planting. They were the same practice, Elena smiled. Perfect. I'll draft a proposal. And Miss Vale, thank you for protecting this, for making sure it wasn't lost. As the afternoon bled into evening, people began to leave, clutching brochures about the residency program and taking photographs of the garden in twilight. By 7, only the board members remained, gathered in the main house for a dinner Agnes had been preparing for a week. Victor raised his glass. To Lydia, who built something beautiful, and to Adrian and Nora, who had the courage to let it grow. They drank to that. Then Claire stood. I have an announcement. The Foundation Board voted this morning to establish the Lydia Hale Garden Fellowship, a funded position for emerging landscape artists to work at Ravenswood for 1 year, learning restoration techniques and developing their own projects. The first fellow will start in September. Applications open next week. She looked at Nora. You'll oversee the program, if you're willing. Nora's throat tightened. I'm willing. Good. Because Lydia would have loved this. She always said art shouldn't be precious. It should be practical. It should teach people to see the world differently and then give them tools to change it. This fellowship does that. It turns her garden into a classroom and her legacy into something living. After dinner, Adrian and Nora walked the garden alone. The lights were on now, strung through the oak branches, turning the paths into something from a fairy tale. This is what she wanted, Adrian said quietly. Not a monument. A continuation. People learning, creating, building on what she started. Are you okay with that? Sharing this space? I'm better than okay. I'm grateful. For 3 years, I thought honoring her meant preserving everything exactly as it was. But that's not honor. That's taxidermy. What we did today, opening the studio, launching the fellowship, letting strangers touch her tools and study her work. That's honor. That's saying she mattered enough to influence the next generation. Nora leaned against him. She'd be proud of you. She'd probably tell me I was being melodramatic and should have done this 2 years ago. But she'd say it with love. She had a gift for delivering brutal truths gently. They stood in the garden until the stars came out, watching the lights glow against the darkness, listening to the fountain and the wind and the particular silence of a place that had been dead and was learning, slowly, to remember how to live. Spring came early that year. By April, the lavender beds were thick with green. By May, the first purple blooms appeared. And by June, the garden looked like something from Lydia's paintings, color and light and the particular magic of things growing exactly where they were meant to be. The fellowship launched with 12 applicants. They chose Kara Chen, a 26-year-old from Seattle who painted urban gardens and wanted to learn how to work with native plants. She moved into the cottage Agnes had vacated when she'd retired to a smaller place in town, and she spent her days with Nora, learning soil composition and companion planting, and the art of letting a garden guide the work instead of imposing rigid plans. Adrian sold his stake in the venture capital firm. He told Claire he was done making money for people who had enough. He wanted to focus on the foundation, on expanding the fellowship, on making sure Lydia's work reached people who needed to see it. Claire told him he was having a midlife crisis. He told her he was having a midlife awakening and there was a difference. In July, Adrian asked Nora to marry him. He did it in the garden beside the lavender beds, with no ring and no grand gesture, just a question asked quietly while they were weeding. Would you want to make this permanent? At the job. Us. Nora looked up from the soil. Are you proposing? I'm asking if you'd be willing to let me try. To build something that doesn't have an expiration date. To stop calling this temporary when we both know it stopped being temporary the night you told me grief wasn't a monument. What about Lydia's ring? That stays with her memory. This would be ours. Something new. Not a replacement. A continuation. He pulled a small box from his pocket, opened it. Inside was a simple silver band, unadorned except for an inscription. Still growing. It's perfect. Is that a yes? It's a yes. They married in September in the garden. With 30 people watching, Claire and her family, Victor and the board, Finch and Caleb and Agnes and Kara, and the artists who'd come through the fellowship, and the scholars who'd studied in the studio and the donors, who'd believed in Lydia's vision enough to fund its continuation. Nora wore green silk. Adrian wore a suit Lydia would have called presentable, and when they exchanged vows they didn't promise forever. They promised today and tomorrow and as many days as they could manage before the garden demanded their attention again. The reception was held in the greenhouse, surrounded by seedlings and the scent of soil and growth. Claire gave a toast about second chances. Victor gave a toast about art outlasting the artist. And Agnes, who'd agreed to come back for the day, gave a toast about stubborn men and patient women and the particular grace required to love someone without trying to fix them. At sunset, Adrian and Nora stood beside Lydia's grave. It was in the garden's north corner beneath an oak tree marked with a simple stone. Lydia Hale, artist, builder of beautiful things. Nora laid lavender on the grave. Adrian touched the stone, then stepped back. Thank you, he said quietly, for the garden, for the time we had, for teaching me that love doesn't end just because the person does. I'm trying to live the way you'd want, with the windows open, with people in the studio, with the belief that beauty matters even when it's hard. I hope that's enough. I hope I'm honoring you by not stopping here. They walked back to the greenhouse, where the reception was still going, where people were dancing to music played by a quartet Claire had hired, where the lights were strung like stars and the laughter sounded like proof that grief and joy could coexist if you gave them space. 6 months later, Nora discovered she was pregnant. She told Adrian in the studio, while they were hanging Lydia's paintings for a new exhibition. He set down the canvas carefully, turned to her and said, Are you sure? I took 3 tests, all positive. How do you feel? Terrified, excited, worried that I'll be terrible at this and the baby will grow up resenting me for not knowing what I'm doing. Adrian laughed. That's called being a parent. Lydia used to say the only people who think they're ready for children are people who've never met children. He pulled Nora close. We'll figure it out together, the same way we figured out the garden. What if I'm not enough? You're already more than enough. You brought a dead garden back to life. You convinced a broken man that living wasn't betrayal. You built a fellowship that's changing how people think about art and landscape. You can handle a baby. What if the baby asks about Lydia? Then we'll tell them the truth. That she was an artist who believed in second chances. That she built something beautiful and left it for other people to tend. That her garden is still growing because people loved her enough to keep it alive. And that they're here because their mother had the courage to love someone who didn't think he deserved it. The baby, a girl, was born in March. They named her Iris, after the flowers Lydia used to plant along the garden's edges. She had Adrian's dark hair and Nora's sharp eyes, and a cry that sounded like she'd already decided the world was fascinating and inadequate in equal measure. Claire brought gifts. Victor brought books about teaching art to children. Agnes brought a blanket she'd knitted herself and a warning. Don't let her near the paint until she's at least 3. Trust me on this. And on Iris's first night home, Adrian carried her to the garden, showed her the lavender beds and the fountain and the studio where her namesake had been painted into dozens of canvases. This is where your story starts, he told her, in a garden that died and came back. With a grandmother you'll never meet but who'll be in every flower we plant and every painting we hang, and every person who comes here to learn how to make beautiful things. And with parents who didn't plan you but chose you anyway, because that's what love is, choosing to build something new on ground that's finally ready to grow. Iris yawned, unimpressed. Nora laughed. She's going to be just like Lydia, completely uninterested in our emotional speeches. Good, Adrian said. The world needs more women who aren't impressed by men's feelings. They stood in the garden as the sun set, painting the sky purple and gold, while their daughter slept and the lavender bloomed and the fountain ran clear and the house that had been a tomb became, finally, a home. Moral. Grief doesn't have an expiration date, but it shouldn't have a monopoly on your future. The people we lose don't want us frozen in their memory. They want us growing toward light, building new gardens, choosing second chances even when they're scary. Love isn't betrayal. Love is the thing that proves we're still capable of it. And the best way to honor the dead is to live fully, love bravely, and leave behind something beautiful for the people who come after. What would you do if your grief was keeping you from your future? Drop a comment. And subscribe, because every ending is just a garden waiting to bloom.